Well, now that we've built a pivot table, we need to see how to format certain elements of that pivot table. Enhancing the formatting can make the pivot table even better at communicating the summary information you want to show. And although we've explored many of the formatting aspects of Excel in previous lessons, the way you apply them in a pivot table can sometimes be just a little different. Let's get started first by just making our pivot table again. I'm going to go back to my data list of homes, and I'm going to summarize with a pivot table, location, realty database, and I'm going to put it on an existing worksheet. I'll click that reference editor, go over to Format Pivot Table, put it at A1, and click OK. Get my builder here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to build it just like we had it. Put bedrooms on the row labels, bathrooms on column labels, price down here in values, and I'll just put city and state as report filters. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is just to name our pivot table. Once I click somewhere on that pivot table, I'm going to be on the pivot table tab, and I'm going to go over and select options, and here I can give my pivot table a name. I'm going to call this PT number of properties. And the name, like a lot of other name ranges, is pretty good to do on a pivot table, because if you want to reference this in another formula or VBA, you can refer back to that pivot table name specifically. Well, now let's look at some of the built-in formats. Again, we've looked at these before as they apply just to regular tables, but with a pivot table they'll apply to the whole table. And we have the different sections. We've got the light formats that tend not to be as dramatic. You get into some medium ones that have a little more highlighting on the column headers or in the data area. And then finally you have the really dark options. And these, a lot of times, these look good on overhead presentations, but they can be a bit much to print out or just to look at in general. So we'll pick kind of a medium of the road one for formatting. So the built-in formats are really great formatting options. In many cases, they're all you're going to need. However, you can tweak just about any aspect of the format you can think of. And one really nice feature of formatting that can be applied is banding. And that's where every other row is shaded, and it makes it much easier to read from left to right or to maintain what column you're on. So when you're on the pivot table, go over to the row and column command on the pivot table header. And you see we've got row headers and column headers. We want to have banded rows, maybe banded columns. Now for this particular style, it did add some banding, but the banding for this style was just a line. So let's click on a little bit more dramatic style and see if we can get some better banding. So here's an option that just has gray bar banding, and this looks really good. You got the headers that are different colors, and then every other row is shaded gray. See what happens if we take that off? They're all the same. And we could do that for columns as well. We could have every other column shaded if we wanted the distinction there. We'll go ahead and leave the banding on. And the nice thing about pivot tables again is if you're filtering things or just looking at a couple elements, the formatting will automatically grow and shrink based on how big your pivot table gets. Well, the next thing we want to talk about in formatting, in our first example we saw how to build a pivot table, but we didn't get real good descriptive labels for our headings. For example, in A5 we've got the text that just says row labels, and in B4 we've just got column labels. We want to make those a little more descriptive. Let's pull our builder back up first so we can see those. And it's really as simple as this, just clicking on A5, and that is the bedrooms, so we can just type the label right in to our formula bar and save for bathrooms. Now for the data area, if you only have one metric or one measure, the description of that measure is going to be up here in A4 on the upper left hand corner of that pivot table. And we're going to go ahead and call that not count number of properties. And it's still the sum now, but that's the next thing we're going to look at. We talked about this a little bit before, changing the aggregation type. If when you first make your pivot table or later you want to change how the data points are summing up all the data, all you have to do is go down to your values box and click the I tab and change the aggregation. And now you see, let's look at all the aggregations that we have. We have sum, count, average, min, max, product, count of numbers, standard deviation, variance. We have many different ways we can aggregate this data. So we're going to do this as count and click OK. Well, now that we've got our aggregation right, let's go ahead and see another setting we can have on the values in aggregation. I'm going to change this to an average price just to get the average price of properties and click OK. And to do that, I'm going to show you how to format by number. So when we're on our pivot table field, we've got a number box over here that we can click on. And this brings up basically the same number formatting options you have in Excel, except for the fact that they're always going to be applied to the data points in your pivot table. Since this is now an average of price, I can say I want to format that as currency, and we've got a sample of how it's going to look. Number of decimal places, I don't need any, so I'll put it as 0. There's really not going to be any negative numbers either, but you could specify how the negatives look too. And click OK. And now all my data points in that pivot table are going to be sorted as currency in the same format. And again, the thing that makes this different is if this pivot table grows or shrinks, like for example, if I make it an outline view, see all the currencies came down this column, but they all got the $ format. They all got the banding. They all got all the formatting aspects we've put on this pivot table. And then I can put it back, and they go right back to where they were. I'll go ahead and change the values back to a general number format and change it back to count. In this lesson, we learned different ways to format our pivot table to make it an even more effective vehicle. We reviewed some of the automatic formatting options and saw how to apply banding to the table. And then finally reviewed a couple of ways to format the numbers themselves within the pivot table.